Well, all of those people that came to the induction service yesterday had the privilege of hearing our moderator, Steve Francis, preach on this passage of Jesus cleansing the temple. So there's a few of you here. You can have an early minute and go now if you want, start on the morning tea. I'm not sure that I'm going to do a better job than he did. He really preached very well yesterday. And I guess this is a passage that speaks all about Jesus' passion. Sometimes the word is actually translated as anger. And then as Steve picked up yesterday, the little part where it talks about the disciples afterwards remembered the passage of Scripture that they associated with this event, and they remembered those words, zeal for the house of the Lord will consume you. And they put those two things together. They saw Jesus' passion, and they remembered that little verse about the zeal for the house of the Lord, and they put those together. And Steve, I guess, started out his sermon getting people to think about an event where we saw great passion. And he spoke about a speech that Barack Obama gave. And every time he sort of basically said one sentence, all the very passionate Americans would jump up and roar and clap and cheer. And he could hardly get his speech out because after every sentence they would clap and cheer. Now, I never have seen that particular speech he was talking about, but I get the picture. But I did see a particular time when Tony Abbott was at a similar sort of event before probably millions of people with the Queen and the Pope. And the Pope stood up and he gave a little blessing and he said, "Watch the crowd." And as he sort of went like this, all the Catholics went mad. You know, they cheered and they roared. They're very passionate about it. And the Queen said, "Don't you worry, I'll get all of the people in the Commonwealth going with just a wave of my hand." And she went to the balcony and she just sort of went. And all the people from all over the Commonwealth went crazy, Catholics and all sorts. And Tony Abbott said, "Well, you think that's good, guys? I will get the entire crowd, both sides, Catholics, everybody, just in an uproar with just a nod of my head." And they all went, rightio. And so he went over the Queen and went, "Bush!" Well, Australians usually aren't... Oh, sorry, that's very irreverent. Irreverent to our politicians as well as the Queen and the Pope, I guess. Usually we're not a passionate group, are we? We don't get up and roar and cheer and go crazy for much. For that we would have loved it. But seriously, what are we really passionate about? We certainly wouldn't do it for a great speech from a Prime Minister. I don't think we'd be cheering and clapping and jumping up and roaring like some nations would and do. I was thinking about some of those things, just simple things that I'm really passionate about. As I said, Steve spoke yesterday really passionately. He's a very, I guess, outwardly passionate person. I'm not that person. I'm not quite like him. But there are things that get me very passionate. And I was thinking, how do I know which ones they are? And I thought yesterday I spent 3 hours with Solomon making you'll think this is silly. He wanted to make a toy hammer, right? But one, great big, like a knight's war hammer type thing. So we made one of those in the shed yesterday. And I loved that. Just making something with my boys is fantastic. And I get very excited about that. I've spent probably 4 or 5 hours in the last week researching how to glue EVA foam together to make suits of armour. Okay, so that's the next project. And I could get wildly passionate about making things with my kids. It's just something where I think, oh, I've got all this energy and you can't, hold me back. And I'm looking, when can I get half an hour to learn how to do this? When can I get some time to do it? Now, maybe you have something similar where you get passionate about, where you're saying, oh, if I just had half an hour spare between this and that, I'm going to jump out and do that. I really want to, if just it was longer, I could, fit that in. What is it that you're saying about that? Maybe it's sewing something, maybe it's knitting something, maybe it's planting something, or watering something that you've already planted and just you want to go out and see it, that it's grown. Maybe it's people. Maybe it's your husband or wife or your kids, whatever. Maybe it's a hobby that you have. Maybe it's doing a job that you love. What is it that gets you really passionate, where your energy is just bursting out of you when you get an opportunity to do it? I was thinking in some ways this passion that we see in Jesus in this little story is almost similar. It's almost akin to in the movies where you see, the commander of his men and he stands up right before battle and he says, come on now guys, whatever. The great speech, a fantastic speech. And they all sort of rally behind him and charge into the fray. It's almost that kind of thing. It's that kind of passion that we see in Jesus. It's life or death sort of stuff. It's, maybe not even or. It's just life and death. We're going to do this wholeheartedly, even if it means dying. That's the kind of passion we're talking about and that we see in Jesus. When Jesus gets to the temple, what he should have seen was a place of prayer, a place of worship, a place where people were bringing in their offerings to sacrifice to God, where people, maybe for the only time that year, for some it would have been not every year that they were making it to the temple because they were just too far away. But when they came, they should have been able to, outside the doors of the church, the temple gates, they would have been able to get hold of an appropriate sacrifice for their family or whatever it might be. If they were particularly poor, they would have bought a dove. And instead of perhaps a lamb or something like that. They would have been able to do that and make their sacrifice and remember all that God had done for them in the Exodus. And remember that God had come close, that God had come to his people in Egypt and taken them out of slavery and brought them to this promised land. And they would be remembering that and reenacting that and really focusing on what God had done for them. They would make their sacrifice so that they knew that they were part of God's family and that they were the ones sort of renewing that commitment and that closeness with God, that salvation that came from God in that particular time. That's what the festival was about. It should have been a wonderful experience to come and do that on behalf of, maybe with your family or some of them, but do that on behalf of all of your family. And there would have been crowds and crowds of people there doing that. But what he actually found when he got there that day was that somehow inside the church proper, inside the area where the women were supposed to be able to pray and come before God, where all of the seekers, the non-Jewish people who'd converted to being Jews, could have come and made their sacrifice, brought their gifts on behalf of their family and renewed that sense of God's salvation, God coming down to them there in the temple, where they could sit and remember that this place was the place of God's presence. The the reminder of God's closeness with them. What he found was that in that area it was full of sheep and cattle, people changing money, birds in cages, and a rabble. Not prayer, not people quietly going about their worship and presenting their sacrifices in an orderly fashion. It was a market stall. And we see Jesus get angry, but in a different kind of way from what we would perhaps normally assume. I mean, he made a whip out of cords, we're told. That's not a hasty thing. If you've ever made whips, they take a while. Even if you were just simply plaiting something long enough to be a whip, it was not a spur of the moment decision. But his passion is, rather than a rage, it's deliberate and it's focused. It's not anger towards a group of people, but what it actually is passion for a group of people. He's not angry at the money changers so much as he's passionate for the people whose space it was. See, what they were doing was just supposed to be outside. I mean, yes, they were a monopoly and they were rorting the system and they were ripping people off, which made it worse. But they should have been doing that outside. They should have been honest about it too. They'd ruined that system with their own greed. But those things needed to take place. People needed to swap their coins. They needed to be able to buy animals. But not there. Not where they were supposed to be praying and remembering what God had done for them personally. It wasn't, put your coin in the slot and, right, you've bought enough for your family, good, next. Jesus wanted to see people connected to God, and they'd ruined all that. And he wanted it back. He wanted it cleansed so that they could get back to God. But really what we see is just a smaller version of what Jesus' whole mission was. It's the same passion that would drive him to the cross, that people would be reconnected to God. It's that same drive that would stop at nothing, even if it meant persecution and death. He would do whatever it took to make sure those people could reconnect with God. And maybe this is one of those moments where Jesus realizes the temple doesn't work. This building and these animals, this system that we've got, isn't cutting it. We've ruined it. And people aren't being connected to God. People are being separated and distracted. And they've forgotten that God is close and that God's salvation is personally given to them. It wasn't working. And so Jesus' passion would go from this day and take him on to the cross. And he did stop at nothing. That little comment at the end that seems sort of out of left field, and I'm sure had many people wondering, well, where did this come from when Jesus says, if you destroy this temple, I will rebuild it in 3 days. John tells us he's talking about his body, so we all kind of go, oh, yeah, of course he is. The people there at the day, I don't know how they were supposed to know that. It's not immediately obvious that he switched from talking about the temple to talking spiritually, which we now understand. Jesus' body becomes the new temple. He becomes the centre point of our focus. He becomes the one that represents God's presence. No longer do you have a building at the uppermost point of the city so that everybody sees it and looks towards it and knows that there is the reminder that God has come close. God's salvation is there for us. Now all of that takes place in Jesus, in his body. He is the closeness of God to people. Jesus was supremely passionate about reconnecting you and I with God. And that was his passion. He would go to any length to make sure that we got there, that we were reconnected to God. That's what this scene is about. Jesus cleans out the temple literally so that the people could have space to reconnect to God. But spiritually, it's a foretaste of what he does for each one of us. He gives us that access to a God who was equally passionate. God would stop at nothing that we could know his salvation was for us. God's passion is mirrored in Jesus' life. Jesus' passion is mirrored in us and in our lives. That might stick a little in your throat, but that's the intent. Jesus did all of that for us so that that passion might then live in us. That passion for God's people might then flow through us. Whether it's your children or your neighbour or the poor people that are starving in Africa, or whether it's the people who've gone through floods and fire, get passionate. God's love for you was so great, he gave up his son. His son's love for you was so great, he would give his life. And he asks, would you love my people with the same passion? Out of that love you have, out of that energy you have, would you share it and give it